All right, quick thoughts. Okay, first of all, the white man, or at least the American white man, or certainly especially the American white man, has always been a liberal in the sense that he has always been universalistic. Okay, so what has changed is not that he was once one thing and now he's another, or that he was even one kind of liberal and now he's another kind of liberal. He was liberal, he is a liberal. Okay, here's what has changed, which is that back in the day, in the 1600s, 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s, okay, his supposed prejudices against other races were actually, what was his grievance with the Negro? What was his grievance with the Inca? His grievance with them was that they were not universalistic in their thinking. His grievance with them was that they essentially were not liberal. Okay, that they did not think in terms of universal norms, and he was right. Okay. Then what happened was that, for whatever reason, and obviously it's pretty clear what those reasons were, but it doesn't really matter what they were ultimately. Okay, but for whatever reason, he he inverted his own logic, and instead of saying, okay, given that I'm a liberal, um, I should spurn these other races because they're not liberal. His view was, given that I'm a liberal, I should embrace these other races no matter what, and therefore spurn myself. Okay, and so he his own logic was twisted, right? But he always kept the same logic. He simply it simply became kinked, but it was the same logic. Okay, it was the same, and that's why it's a particularly destructive situation. It's not that he was one thing and now he's another. He is the same thing. He was tough and now he's not tough, but his loss of toughness does not have to do with his ceasing to be what he was. It has to do with his continuing to be what he was, but in a slightly different way, which is not good. Which means it's not going to be easily corrected or reversed, because it's not a Jekyll and Hyde situation. It's kind of a Jekyll 1, Jekyll 2 situation, and such subtle gradations are hard to turn to kind of good political account. And then there's also a point about existentialism. Okay, so Sartre had to come along and preach the virtues of existentialism, which itself is inconsistent with existentialism, right? Because existentialism had to be sold to people in exactly the way in which a religion is sold to people. He had to proselytize, and of course, the whole time he was saying he wasn't proselytizing, but that's what all proselytizers do, pretty much, or at least that's what a lot of them do. So, this is meant to tie back in with my point from a few days ago about how economic forces uh, economic forces really are the tail that does not wag the dog. It is the tail that is wagged by the dog. And Marx was trying to be really smart and say the opposite of what is obviously the truth, and he ended up basically saying wrong things, just utterly wrong and uninformative and not insightful. And then another point is that so I was talking about how most people do nothing, and that's very true. There are a couple of points to make about doing nothing. Okay, which is that if somebody has a given job, it may require, actually there are 3 points I'd like to make. If somebody has a given job, okay, there are a couple of there are three questions that have to be asked. Okay, one, does that job consist in nothing more than maintaining an equilibrium? Okay, so if you look at what Donald Trump did, or any businessman, not that Donald Trump was a great business. Well, he actually was a great businessman. I mean, what he was doing was fairly crude. He just happened to do it to a large degree. But he's a textbook case of a businessman. But he was not just about he was not about being part of an equilibrium. He was about making affirmative changes. And if you look at what a cop does or a professor does, actually, I mean, there have been professors who made changes. I mean, not many, but there have been. But it was not in their capacity as professors that they did so ever. But if you look at what a cop does, or a latter-day professor, or a lawyer, I mean, most professionals, not all, well, actually, most professionals, it's simply about being part of an equilibrium. Okay, so anyway, you have to ask yourself the following two questions. First of all, uh, does their job consist in nothing more than carrying out orders? Now, it may be that a lot of intelligence is required to carry out those orders, but an order is an order, is an order, right? And if what they do consists in carrying out orders, even if they're orders that require intelligence to carry out, they're not doing anything. Okay, they're being done unto. The other thing is that if their profession or job or whatever consists in their being part of an equilibrium, then they're not doing anything. They will rationalize, okay, and they will tell themselves and maybe others that their actions are a sort of vector sum of agency and conformity or whatever, but that's not true. Okay, that's not what they're. They're a different thing. Okay, so there's just there's the policeman model, which is just you take orders and that's the end of it. Then there's the slimy shitbag, kind of midwit history professor who's part of an equilibrium or whatever, which is just a new age loser way of doing what a cop does. Okay, and all right, and then there's another very important distinction, which is that when you actually look at what a real entrepreneur does, not a kind of fake entrepreneur who's just part of an organization, um, but a real entrepreneur. Um, okay, let me invert what I was about to say. When you actually look at a philosophy professor, let's consider a very intelligent philosophy professor. Okay, when you actually look um, at there are two dimensions to his work, to his professional existence. On the one hand, there's the work he does, the actual books and articles, which in this day and age amount to nothing, but 100 years ago might have amounted to something in some cases. Okay, so those require a lot of intelligence. Okay, even today. All right. But then there is what he does in order to move forward in a strictly professional way, which was utterly divorced from his actual work. And that, first of all, it's divorced from his actual work, and it's also but that's one thing. The other thing is that the amount of intelligence that is involved in those strictly professional advances is zero. I mean, is less than what is involved in becoming, the chief fry guy at a Burger King. Less. I mean, there's just no intelligence involved. Now, the people who uh, you know, do get these promotions or whatever do have intelligence, but no intelligence is involved in it. I mean, zero. Um, and whereas when you look at what an investment banker does, I mean, what he does in order to move forward professionally requires intelligence, and what he does in his capacity, what he does when he's discharging his obligations to clients, also requires intelligence. And in fact, they're kind of the same thing, right? So in the case of the professor, what is involved in getting tenure or whatever is basically just pasting on a shit-eating grin, and that's the end of it. That's it. Period. Okay. Then you write some articles because you like it, and the articles actually have almost no have almost no significance in terms of getting a professorship or retaining a professorship or being given promotions once you have a professorship. I mean, actually, essentially none. When you're trying to get tenure, they do want to see a few so-called articles and so-called good journals, but which means you're talking around 11 pages of work that that the average 15-year-old would be ashamed to produce. Okay, and but it's just sort of threaded into these politically driven exchanges. It's really sick. Anyway, but the thing is that when you're looking at when you consider somebody who actually does something, there isn't this complete sharp distinction between what the guy is doing just to put food on his own table and what the guy is doing to actually do what he does. And when you have that kind of a sharp distinction, it means that the person isn't really doing anything, or it suggests it. Okay. So, oh yeah, and then okay, so there's another thing, which is that okay, so we talk about how, I mean, anyone who's not a complete moron, but is tends to talk about what a screw up, what a farce liberalism, contemporary liberalism is. Okay, well that's all true, right? But maybe the problem isn't really that the maybe the problem with liberalism, contemporary liberalism, is not that the views are wrong. Maybe the problem is that maybe the problem is that the idea that lies at the essence of it is that it's all about having the right views as opposed to some other thing. So basically what ended up happening was that back in the day, nobody really cared what your political views were. Okay, I mean unless you were a political philosopher, nobody really cared all that much. Um, and most people were not. Most people were doers, right? And then what happened is liberalism came along, and it stuffed their little heads with all these ideas. Okay, now were those ideas true or false? That's not relevant. What's relevant is that for some reason, when those ideas were put in their heads, it somehow the message that was sent to them was that it's not about doing things, it's about having the right views. Okay, which turned them into non-agents. I mean, that's what it did. And so it's not that liberal views are wrong, and I mean you can take issue with this or that particular liberal doctrine, right? But some of them are good, some of them are not. Okay, but maybe it's not that they're the wrong views. Maybe that it's that embodied in those views is the view that it's all about having views and not some other thing, and that kind of paralyzed people. It kind of turned them into it somehow falsified their existence or de-agentialized them. All right, some good thoughts in there and a few that need work. That'll be it for now.